Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Brad Breeding, president of MyLifeSite.net, and I look forward to walking you through 8 ways to evaluate the financial viability of a life plan community, also referred to as a continuing care retirement community or a CCRC. If you're on this call, it's probably because you're considering a continuing care community for yourself, a loved one, or possibly even a client. And therefore, I want to be sure that you know some of the most popular or important questions you should ask as you do your research. One of the things that I hear most frequently from prospective residents of life plan communities, particularly when there's an entry fee involved, is how do I know that my money is safe? Or how can I be sure the community will be able to meet its long-term obligations to me? And while there's no way to guarantee a provider's long-term financial standing, the 8 points that I'm going to cover today will at least give you a comprehensive overview and a really good head start in terms of the types of things you can ask about. Before jumping in, let me give you a quick introduction to MyLifeSite.net. We are an online resource for unbiased information and analysis related to life plan communities. On our website, you can access more information similar to what I'll be sharing with you today, in addition to community profile reports, side-by-side comparisons, and other helpful resources to help guide you through the decision process. After the webinar today, I hope you'll check us out, if you haven't already, at mylifesite.net. You'll see that web address located at the bottom of each of the slides that I'm going to go through today. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. First, a quick disclosure. I want to make sure that you know the information we're providing today should not be intended in any way as financial, tax, or legal advice. I would recommend that each of you seek the advice of your own advisors, financial, legal, tax, or otherwise, before you make any determinations about the financial viability of a community. I also want to cover a couple of introductory comments before we jump in. The following 8 indicators are really intended just to give you a general sense of a provider's financial viability. But as I mentioned a moment ago, there's really nothing that can guarantee the long-term financial success of a community. So this is a non-exhaustive list. There are certainly many other factors to be considered, which are not included in this presentation today. Also, when evaluating a provider, you should take a comprehensive view of these indicators that I'm going to go over, and you shouldn't necessarily expect the provider to exhibit each and every one of these things at any given point in time. And then finally, startup communities should be evaluated differently from established providers. Generally, an established provider is considered to be a community that's been operating for at least 8 years or longer. So at the very end, I'll touch on that a little bit more, but most of what we're going to talk about today really is more applicable to communities that have already been developed and have been operating for at least a few years, if not more. Okay, so number one, the first thing you want to look for when researching the financial viability of a continuing care community or a life plan community is what is the occupancy ratio in independent living. This is the first one for a reason, because residents living in the independent living phase of a life plan community really are financially the lifeblood of a community. The higher the occupancy ratio in independent living, the higher the chance that the community is in good financial standing. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the case, but it certainly helps a great deal. So the higher that occupancy ratio, the better. But generally, a ratio of 90% or more indicates strong demand for the community and contributes to a stronger balance sheet. And you don't necessarily want to look just at occupancy levels today. Obviously, that's where you want to start. But it's also important to kind of look at the direction occupancy's been trending over the past year or two. On an industry-wide basis, occupancy levels decreased to around 86% following the Great Recession in 2008. And again, that's on an industry-wide basis. And since that time, they've rebounded to almost 92% nationally. So that's kind of a benchmark for comparison. But you may find situations where a provider had low occupancy in the past, but now they're maybe under new management or a new marketing team. Maybe they've developed a new section or done some renovations or something like that that makes it more attractive in the marketplace. And so you may see that occupancy trending higher. So that's a really good sign. And then at times, there may be a reason for a sudden dip in occupancy. But the key is the ability to refill those residences in fairly short order. And so that all comes back to demand in the marketplace. When there's demand, typically that's going to translate into higher occupancy, which translates into a better balance sheet. Number 2, is there positive cash flow from operations? So cash flow from operations, which generally comes from a combination of 2 things, monthly fees paid by the residents and also non-refundable entry fees. And so that means, any entry fees that are paid but are not refundable. Any portion of that entry fee that's not refundable to the resident if they move out or at death or something like that, then those 2 things, the monthly fees, non-refundable entry fees, that's generally what we're talking about when we say cash flow from operations. And so what you're looking for, ideally is that those cash flows are sufficient to cover operating expenses on an annual basis. So this is often measured using something called called net operating margin. It essentially just shows what percentage of the revenue from residents goes towards paying for services provided to those residents. At times you may find a negative cash flow, and that for a short period of time. As with the occupancy ratio I mentioned a moment ago, there may be a valid reason for that in the short term, but certainly it should not be a long-term trend. Number 3, do current assets exceed current debts? Before I jump into this one, I want to make clear that if you do not have an accounting background or you're not well versed at interpreting financial statements, particularly financial statements related to CCRCs, because they operate a little bit differently, given that they have entry fees and refundable entry fees. Those are some things that a typical business doesn't have. And so if you're not equipped to analyze these sort of ratios, then I would certainly suggest that you, as I mentioned earlier, talk with a professional who is. But by looking at these slides and hearing this webinar, at least you kind of know what to ask, and you can ask them to look at these things for you. So number 3, do current assets exceed current debts? So the ratio of current assets to current debts is referred to as the current ratio. And what we mean by current, current assets and current debts are those that are expected to be realized or paid within the next 12 months. So these are short-term assets, short-term debts. And the ratio really is an indication of whether an organization is in position to repay its liabilities with its assets. And so it is really a measure of liquidity. Conceptually, this is similar to a net worth calculation, but it's based on a provider's current or short-term assets and debts. Number 4, is there a future service obligation? Now, the last 2 that I've mentioned really were based on financial ratios, which are great for giving you a snapshot of where a community stands currently with their finances. And certainly there are many other ratios that could be analyzed besides just the 2 that I've mentioned. But those really give you a snapshot of what's happening right now. But it's also important to consider, what are the projections for the long-term financial viability? And that's kind of the next 2 I'm going to cover really speak more to that. So number 4, is there a future service obligation? So what does that mean? Well, a future service obligation, sometimes referred to as an FSO, really points to whether there is enough money projected to be coming in the future to cover the expected cost. So it's expected long-term cost of services, or if the expected long-term cost of services exceeds the expected revenues, then this is going to be referred to as a future service obligation. So basically it means there's a shortfall in the future in terms of the provider's ability to provide services to residents, particularly healthcare related services. A future service obligation will be shown on the balance sheet as a long-term liability. So when you're talking with a provider, if you're interested in a particular community, you can ask them if there is a future service obligation on their books. Generally, most often you will not find this. Very few communities that we've seen have this, but it's not to say that some do not. So you want to certainly ask that question and make sure that you can kind of check that one off the list. If there is an FSO, a future service obligation, then I would also recommend that you ask what's being done to address that. It may not be that big of a deal. It may be that they're not too far off and they're just making a few adjustments, but certainly you want to find out what's being done to address that situation. Number 5, has a detailed actuarial analysis been performed? So this is really similar to what I just went over when we were talking about the FSO, but it takes it a step further. An actuarial analysis should be performed by a certified actuary, and it assesses additional factors not necessarily covered in the FSO calculation. It covers things like long-term debt, capital expenditures, planned expansions, and things like that, so it accounts for all of those things as well. And so it's essentially a broader and more detailed review of the provider's long-term ability to meet its obligations. So the report should indicate that future obligations to current residents are covered, that new resident fees are adequate, and that positive cash flows are projected for the long term. So this is not necessarily something that should be done every single year by a provider, but you know, a CCRC it would do well to have an actuarial analysis performed at least every, I know, 2 to 4 years perhaps. So you want to just ask them when the last time was that they had one of these performed. Hopefully they've had one done at some point, at least within the last few years or so. But you can ask them about that and, you know, what the result was of that analysis. Number 6, is the provider financially regulated by the state? Or does the state in which the provider is located financially regulate CCRCs? So this is one of those things where, first of all, it's important to understand that life plan communities, CCRCs, are regulated at the state level, not at the federal level. And not every state is going to regulate CCRCs. Some do not at all. But for those that do, if you're looking at a community that is in a state that regulates CCRCs, then that can really offer an additional layer of oversight for you, for the consumer. And so they may require certain cash reserves. The state may require that they hold certain amounts in cash reserves, or maybe they require that they adhere to certain financial ratios, similar to those that I mentioned earlier, or some other things like that. But anyway, it's certainly, you know, just because a community is located in a state that provides regulation does not mean that certainly doesn't guarantee that community's viability in any way. But you do know there's another set of eyes looking over that. And a lot of times the state will almost, you know, if they see a community that's not meeting their requirements, and they may have them on their own sort of internal watch list. That's certainly not something they're going to share with consumers, I don't believe, but they have a way of kind of keeping an eye on this and maybe putting certain communities on notice and things of that nature if they're not meeting these different financial requirements. On the flip side of that, just because a community is located in a state that is not regulated doesn't mean that they're not strong financially. There are lots of communities located in states that don't provide regulation and are doing very well and are very strong financially. So again, it's not, certainly doesn't indicate or mean that those communities are stronger in any way, but just another set of eyes. So depending on the state you're in, you could research that. You could just go to search online, Google or what have you, and just type in, CCRCs in your state and maybe, regulation, and just see. Usually it's going to be on that state's website, and it could be in different, whatever the department or division is. Here in North Carolina, for instance, it's the Department of Insurance that regulates CCRCs, but it could be a different department in another state. Number 7, what are your bond ratings? You'll notice I said if applicable. This is only really something that applies to about 25% of CCRCs out there. And these are the communities that have rated debt in terms of, they've utilized public debt or bonds to finance the initial development or expansion. And as a part of that, they requested to have their bonds rated by a rating agency, such as Moody's or, a Fitch or S&P. And so this is a voluntary decision. It's usually done to increase the chance of success for a bond issuance. And therefore, usually if a community does have a bond rating, it's probably going to be a favorable one. But a rating of BBB, BBB minus actually, or higher, is an indication of financial strength. You know that one of those rating agencies has really done a deep dive into the books of this organization to come up with that rating. And so they're looking at everything that I'm covering here today and much, much more. But not every provider that issues debt will have a debt rating. So kind of like I mentioned a minute ago with states located or communities located in states with regulation, just because a community does not have rated debt doesn't necessarily mean that they're not strong financially. But for those that do, there again, that's just one more set of eyes on things. So if they have a BBB rating or higher, that's an investment grade rating, particularly something in the A's, shows very strong finances. So that's something you can ask about, but as I mentioned, it's only going to apply to about a quarter of the communities that are out there. And then finally, number 8, are financial covenants being met? This also, you'll see I've put if applicable. So this one also may not apply to every community, but those providers that utilize debt financing from a bank, not bonds necessarily, but just bank lending, will often be held to strict financial covenants by that lender. And so you can inquire with the senior living provider to learn, number 1, how they're financed, if there is debt, and if so, if there have been any recent violations of those bond covenants. So the lender will generally require that they meet certain, metrics on an ongoing basis. And, there certainly can be a community that has had covenant violations, and sometimes they're not that big of a deal, frankly. It's something that can be addressed fairly quickly. But in other cases, that may not be the situation. So you first just want to find out if there have been any covenant violations. That's something you can ask a member of the staff or the finance team at the community. And if there have, then clearly that's something you want to ask more about, ask how that's being addressed and what the reason was for it, and so forth. Okay, so those are the 8 that I wanted to cover with you today. As I mentioned in the beginning, there's really no single measure for determining a provider's long-term financial viability, but certainly satisfactory answers to the majority of the things that we've mentioned today can really provide a good sense of, I guess, level of comfort or added assurance. So it's certainly a non-exhaustive list. There's other things you can look at, whether it's the experience of the management team, board of directors, and so forth and so on. But these are a few things that really can give you a good head start. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that these are really types of things you might look for in a more established provider. Startup communities probably should be viewed a little bit differently. It's not going to be uncommon for them to have a higher level of debt in most cases. They might show negative equity early on. And, so in that case, the financial ratios and things like that aren't going to look as favorable, but that's justified in that case. So what you want to really look for with startups is more things like, do they have a really comprehensive strategic and marketing plan in place? Their management team and the experience of rolling out communities. The biggest thing with a new community is making sure that they are on track in terms of when they hope to fill those units. You know, bond defaults for new communities usually occur, if they're going to occur, you have a higher chance of that happening when management underestimates the amount of time that they will need to fill those units with new residents, and as a consequence, funds can become exhausted. So that's called the absorption period. And if that takes longer than anticipated, that can really be a cash drain on a new community. So you just want to make sure that they're really creating that demand in the marketplace, that they're filling those units, that they're on track, that they're going to have really high occupancy levels early on, so forth and so on. So certainly more to cover than that, but I just want to make sure you are aware that there are some different metrics that you might look at for new communities as opposed to established communities. So thank you for attending this webinar. I hope you've learned something. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, for more information like this, you can visit our website, mylifesite.net. You see that web address here on the screen. And thank you again. I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.